Second video, we're going to go through the different methods you can use for your job evaluation. My cat has decided to join me, so if you can hear her purring in the background, she's on my lap. So let's go through some of these methods. There's 3 that our book talks about specifically. The first is the ranking method, and it's just what it says it is. You're going to rank order the jobs in your organization from highest to lowest based on some generic definition of relative value to your organization's success so that the highest ranked jobs are paid the most and the lowest ranked are paid the lowest. There are 2 common ways of doing the ranking. One is called alternation ranking, and that's you order your job descriptions alternately, starting from the extremes and then going all the way into the middle. So if you had 10 jobs, for example, you would start with the top job and the very bottom job. And those would be kind of your anchors for the rest of your other jobs. Then the next decision is what's the second job after the first job and what's the 9th job before the 10th job. Another way that you can do this is paired comparison, where you compare each job to another job. So there's an example here on the right that I got off of Google. In this job, in this organization, they have 5 jobs they're going to compare for their job evaluation, A, B, C, D, and E. So on A, if we went through that row, if you compare A to B, B gets a point because B is apparently higher ranked than A. But A is higher ranked than C, so C gets 0 points. A is higher ranked than D, so it gets 0 points. But E is higher ranked than A, so it gets 1 point. So what will happen is each column you'll have 4 scores here because you only have 5 jobs and you're comparing those jobs with each other. And so the highest, the job with the highest points, here it's 3, so it's E on the very bottom row. That will be your highest ranked job, and that will be the one that's paid the most. As you can already see with the compared comparison example here, what is ranked second in that might be a tie. So here A, B, and D all have 2 points. So they're tied in terms of their ranking. So you can either pay all of those jobs exactly the same, or if you needed more detail, you might be able to figure out a way to differentiate which of these jobs is second, third, and fourth in your ranking. The benefits are that this ranking method is really fast. It's very simple. I mean, I just explained this to you. You could explain this to a child. As long as you have job descriptions, you can do this very easily. And it's very inexpensive. You can do this manually. You don't need a computer to do this. But as you can see, maybe even from these examples, you don't want a lot of jobs. If you have lots and lots of jobs, it's going to be very hard to do the ranking method. And in the long run, the results from your ranking method might be difficult to defend because you created a broad definition of how you were ranking these jobs. So it's not going to be clear to other people how those jobs got ranked. And then as jobs change over time, or if you add new jobs, it might not be clear where they go in that ranking system then. If that happens, sometimes what you have to do is go back after you have an internal structure already created and change and alter the structure with the ranking method, even though you used a method to create that structure, and that can be very costly in terms of time and money. You also, if you're going to do this, the evaluators who are doing the ranking method have to know all these jobs really well. So that's why you can almost only do this method when you have very few jobs, like in a startup or in a small company. Because otherwise, most HR professionals don't know all of the jobs intimately in the workplace that they're at because there's just too many of them and too many details. And if you don't know all of them, it's really hard to do a ranking method because that broad criteria that you're using to rank those jobs requires you to know the nuances of the jobs as well. Our second method is the classification method. And it's much more useful if you have lots and lots of jobs in your organization because you're going to create a series of classes that cover a range of jobs in your organization. And each class will have a class description that describes what kinds of jobs go in that class. And then what you'll do is you'll take your job descriptions that you created in your job analysis, and then you're going to compare them to each class description to figure out where each job description goes in terms of those classes. And I just put a very, very simple example on this slide of what this would look like. Say we're in a small office job. We could have a classification method where we have one class is managerial jobs, another class is professional jobs, and a third class is the support staff in that office. The result is that you have a job structure that's made up of a series of classes with a number of jobs in each. And actually, this will make much more sense later why this could be a very helpful method in creating your internal structure, because sometimes this is how we figure out our pay grades a little bit, or at least it helps us organize that information later when we're creating our internal structure. These are much more manageable than the ranking method when you have a large number of jobs, but you do have to determine the number of classes that you're going to have, and you have to write class descriptions that are very well defining those classes, so they're very separate from each other. If you don't define the boundaries between each class, it can be really hard to figure out when job descriptions overlap two classes, which class that job description should go in. And then you also would have to defend your decision as well later to stakeholders. The one kind of complication with this method is if you have good class descriptions, it may seem pretty straightforward how you would compare your job descriptions to those class descriptions and stick jobs into each class. But you're also going to be, for your internal structure, comparing your job descriptions to benchmark jobs and also to other jobs as well. So there may be other reasons that people are going to get paid differently that aren't just what class their job is in, but also what is the external market paying for a benchmark job that's related to that job, or how that job compares to other jobs that may be in that same class, but kind of like some sort of hierarchy within that class of the jobs to figure out the internal pay structure within the classes and then across the classes as well. The third method our book talks about is the point methods. This is the most quantitative method of the three we've talked about. And the point method, the basis is these compensable factors. And then you choose your compensable factors. You have factor degrees that are numerically scaled for each job that you have. And then you'll have weights for each factor about how important that factor is to your organization's strategy. In choosing compensable factors, you do have to think about your organization's strategy and how the work that each person does in their job contributes to that objective and strategy. So you're going to try to find compensable factors that relate each job to the strategy. Your factors are scaled to reflect the degree to which each of those compensable factors is present in each job, which means you need very good job descriptions. So you would need a good job analysis before you could do the point method. And then you have to weight on those compensable factors, you have to weight them for overall importance to your strategy. So for example, if you have two compensable factors, one could be managing people and another one could be organizing projects. Maybe the managing people is more important to your strategy overall, then that would have a higher weight than organizing projects would in your compensable factors in your point method. My cat has rejoined us now, so if you hear her meowing, that's her coming back. So how do you determine what compensable factors you're going to choose? Well, obviously, this is going to be dependent on your organizational strategy. What this also means, though, is if you change your organizational strategy, you may have to go back to your compensable factors and change those, which means you have to redo your entire job evaluation to realign your internal compensation system with your new strategy. The compensable factors should be based on the work itself. So what are people actually doing in your organization, not how the job descriptions were written originally. So that's where the job analysis becomes really key. And the compensable factors have to be accepted by all stakeholders or by the stakeholders involved in the decision. So employees, managers, union, and any other stakeholders that will care about the outcome of or the internal structure that you create. These also have to be reliable and valid, which means you have to have compensable factors that you can easily define what they are, and then you can easily identify them within the job descriptions you have. If you can't define them very well, or if you can't identify them easily in job descriptions, they're not going to be very useful for creating your point factor system or your system based on your point factor method. So generally across the different kinds of compensable factors that organizations choose, they tend to fall in these four generic groups on the left here about compensable factors are created around the skills required to do a job, around the effort required to do that job, around the responsibility for either people or things such as projects that people might have in their jobs, and then their working conditions. if you say you had to do this in a job and you really don't want to go through the effort of trying to figure out what the compensable factors could be within your organization, or maybe you're just one person who's trying to do this method alone, you might want to pick some compensable factors that have already been created. And that's what the Hay method does. It's a method that has 3 factors: know-how, problem solving, and accountability. And our book actually defines those in much more detail than I have here on the slide. But you could just use those 3 factors. And for lots of knowledge work jobs, like the office example I had earlier with managers, professionals, and support staff, you could use the Hay method compensable factors to organize all of those jobs without having to create your own compensable factors or having to do the research to figure out what you would use otherwise. One problem with the Hay method that you might be able to see already is, even if you went to the book and looked at the definition for know-how, problem solving, and accountability, there is some overlap in these compensable factors. So know-how is kind of the knowledge and skills that you need to do the job. Well, you have to have some know-how to be able to do problem solving. So there's a little overlap there. And then you have to have problem solving to be held accountable for decisions you're making. So there's a little bit of overlap, but the Hay method has very descriptive or detailed descriptions around these factors, so it can be useful for lots of different kinds of jobs. But how many compensable factors do we really need to create then? I mean, if you use the Hay method, you only have 3 compensable factors that you're using to organize all of the jobs in your organization. Well, when we're trying to create our own compensable factors, or if we wanted to use the Hay method and potentially add some compensable factors to it to make it more unique and reflective of the strategy that our organization has, we might add a few more, but we don't want to add too many. One problem we can have with compensable factors is what's called the illusion of validity. As I mentioned, even with the Hay method, some of these factors can have overlapping definitions, which makes it hard to figure out. Essentially what happens is, if you have overlapping definitions, you might be paying twice for part of a job that contributes to strategy, because that part of the job is in 2 different compensable factors. You also may fail to account for something unique in the criterion that you've chosen if you have this overlap. So you might be missing parts of jobs that are actually really important to your strategy if you don't have enough factors, or if you have overlapping definitions and you're not completely covering the universe of of things that your organization would think is important to actually implementing the strategy and the objectives that you have. Another issue you can have is small numbers. Sometimes you have to create compensable factors that actually apply to very few jobs, but once you've created a factor in your system, other workers will likely say that factor's in their job as well, even if when you created the compensable factor and actually did your point method, you never found that compensable factor in their job. So you have to now defend that choice, and then you'll have to explain to those employees why that's not really part of their job. Some research in our book alludes to this, suggests that most organizations really only need 3 to 7 compensable factors to create an internal structure for all the jobs in their organization. However, there's a really great example in the book of an organization that has 21 compensable factors. And when researchers reverse the process, so they took the internal structure that the organization had and then reversed it to figure out how many compensable factors would explain the differences in jobs that created the internal structure they already had, they found that they actually only needed about 3 factors. But the reason this organization has 21 factors is because they had lots of stakeholders involved in making these decisions. And to gain buy-in from those stakeholders, you may have to keep compensable factors that stakeholders believe are very unique, but in theory are actually not that unique and you don't really need, just to get them to buy into the system that you create, the internal structure you create, but also so you don't have to go back and change that internal structure to something that maybe doesn't make sense with the method that you used. So instead of going through how to do the point method, which our book describes very well, I'm going to let you read that. I also included it in the outline of notes for the book chapter. What I really wanted to do at the end of this slideshow is just talk about, why do you even bother with the job evaluation method? If you recall from the last video at the very end, I talked about how most organizations actually figure out their pay structure more with external or market factors. How much do other organizations pay for these benchmark jobs, than they do with an internal structure, doing a whole job evaluation process and then figuring out how the jobs are organized within their organization. However, I also mentioned that even if you do use external or market information to determine how much to pay jobs, you probably still have to have some job evaluation because you may have jobs that are unique to your organization that you can't find benchmark jobs for in other organizations. Job evaluation itself, if you use this method or even use a little bit, it creates an order and logic. So it has a way to justify the pay decisions that you've made and the internal structure that you have for your organization. But as we've even seen with some of these examples, it can be pretty complex, especially if you have lots of different jobs. And there could be a lot of bureaucracy involved in documenting exactly how you determined, for example, with the point method, how many points each job had. Because of all of those details, sometimes people lose the forest for the trees, especially in later years if they're still using the same job evaluation method to incorporate new jobs or job descriptions that have changed. They may lose sight of what the strategy was that the organization had that created this job evaluation method. And then they end up following the rules so much that they don't think about, well, do these compensable factors, for example, in our point method still even matter? Is this still consistent with the strategy we have today? So the focus then becomes on the job evaluation rather than on how that job evaluation helps the organization meet its objectives and the strategy it has. Because jobs are constantly changing, and that's why I think if you work in HR, especially in compensation, you may have to do this at least once in your career because they're constantly changing. Your job evaluation has to be flexible as well. So you might have an entire booklet that describes how you came up with the internal structure that you have now. And it can be very detailed, but there has to be some flexibility because again, we're going to add new jobs in the future. We're going to have job descriptions that change. We do need the guidelines because if you have flexibility so that you can add new jobs in, but you don't have guidelines about how to do that, your process can become chaotic to the point where you almost don't have a process at all. And then what happens is, and this is, you can see this in some organizations, this is why sometimes they have to hire consultants. They'll realize they have really irrational pay rates. And when I say irrational pay rates, they'll have things like a supervisor is paid less than the employee they supervise. That's most of us would consider that pretty irrational. And that's not the way it really is supposed to work in any internal structure in an organization. So what happens is you have to go back and reevaluate and essentially redo your job evaluation process to some extent to fix some of those problems. So there's always going to be kind of this pros and cons of kind of how detailed do you want to make your job evaluation process so that you can explain how you got the internal structure you did so you can justify the decisions you make and so other people can follow that job evaluation method should they need to add new jobs. But then how flexible do you make it for jobs that don't exist yet or for job descriptions that have to change drastically for which you didn't have any example for when you created the job evaluation method. So it's kind of an art and science in creating these things. As you'll see throughout the class, that's kind of how creating a compensation structure works in organizations a lot of times.